Ambassador Zaraveltar had never imagined that the most important negotiation of her career would take place in a small cafe on Earth's moon colony. The Galactic Council had chosen her specifically for this mission because of her reputation for finding peaceful solutions to the most complex conflicts. What they hadn't anticipated was that she would fall in love with a human. Dr. Marcus Chun sat across from her, his dark eyes focused on the holographic displays showing troop movements across 3-star systems. The Kethmar Empire had been expanding aggressively for the past 2 years, conquering 12 worlds and enslaving their populations. The Council's response had been predictably bureaucratic. Economic sanctions, strongly worded resolutions, and endless committee meetings. The evacuation ships from Kepler 442b should reach the refugee stations within 6 hours, Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much suffering. As the head of the Interstellar Humanitarian Aid Organization, he had coordinated the rescue of over 2 million civilians from Kethmar-occupied territories. Zara reached across the table and touched his hand. Even after 3 years of marriage, the simple contact sent warmth through her scaled skin. Humans, she had learned, were incredibly tactile beings, and Marcus had taught her to appreciate the comfort of touch. The Council approved funding for another refugee settlement on Proxima Centauri C, she said, trying to keep her tone hopeful. It's not much, but it's not enough. Marcus pulled up another display, showing casualty reports from the latest Kethmar advance. They're not just conquering worlds, Zara. They're systematically breaking the spirit of entire species. The psychological profiles we're seeing from survivors, it's deliberate torture on a planetary scale. Zara's throat sacs fluttered, a sign of distress among her people, the Velani. As one of the Council's most experienced diplomats, she had worked tirelessly to maintain the fragile peace that had existed in this galaxy for over a century. The Galactic Accords clearly stated that conflicts should be resolved through negotiation, mediation, and economic pressure. Military intervention was considered a last resort, to be authorized only after all peaceful options had been exhausted. The Kethmar are not unreasonable, she said, though the words fell hollow even as she spoke them. Ambassador Krull has agreed to another round of negotiations next week. Perhaps if we offer them exclusive mining rights to the Altair system. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The few other patrons in the cafe looked over briefly before returning to their conversations. Zara, I love you more than anything in this universe, but I can't keep pretending that your council's approach is working. The peace is held for 107 years, Zara said, her voice taking on the formal tone she used during official negotiations. Before the Galactic Accords, this galaxy was torn apart by wars that lasted centuries. Billions died in conflicts that could have been prevented through proper diplomatic channels. And how many billions are dying now while your council debates the proper font size for their resolutions? Marcus's voice was quiet, but Zara could hear the anger beneath his controlled tone. I've been a Kepler, 442b, Zara. I've seen what the Kethmar do to captured civilians. I've held dying children while their parents begged me to explain why no one was coming to help them. Zara felt her secondary heart begin to race, a physiological response that occurred when Velani faced moral conflict. Marcus, please understand. The moment we abandoned diplomatic solutions, we opened the door to the kind of galactic warfare that nearly destroyed all of our civilizations. The humans fought among themselves for millennia before joining the Council. You of all people should understand the importance of peaceful resolution. Marcus turned to look out the cafe's large window, which offered a view of Earth hanging in the black sky like a blue marble. You know what's funny about human history, Zara? Every time we've faced a truly existential threat, every time we've encountered pure evil, peace was never the answer. Peace was what we fought for, what we achieved after we destroyed the threat. But evil doesn't negotiate. Evil doesn't compromise. Evil only understands one language. What are you saying? Zara stood and joined him at the window, placing her hand on his shoulder. I'm saying that the Kethmar understands something about humans that your council doesn't. Marcus pulled up his personal tablet and showed her a classified report marked with the seal of the Human Defense Consortium. They've been studying human military history for the past year. Battle of Thermopylae, Normandy, Stalingrad, the Siege of Terra during the AI Wars. They know that humans have a particular talent for warfare. Zara read the report with growing alarm. The Kethmar had compiled detailed analyses of human combat psychology, tactical innovations, and what they termed escalation thresholds. According to their research, humans possessed an unusual combination of strategic thinking and berserker instincts that made them uniquely dangerous opponents. They're afraid of us, Marcus continued. That's why they haven't attacked any human colonies directly. They're testing the Council's resolve, seeing how far they can push before humanity decides that enough is enough. The Human Defense Consortium is bound by the same accords as every other Council member, Zara said, though she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. Humanity agreed to submit to peaceful arbitration for all interstellar disputes. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Zara, do you know why the Human Defense Consortium was formed? To coordinate defensive measures for human colonies in accordance with Council guidelines. No. Marcus turned away from the window and looked directly into her large golden eyes. The HDC was formed because every major human government realized that the Galactic Council's idea of defense was fundamentally inadequate. We agreed to try your way, to give peace a chance, but we never agreed to let innocent people die while bureaucrats debate proper procedures. Zara felt a chill run through her body. Marcus, what aren't you telling me? Before he could answer, both of their communicators chimed simultaneously with an emergency alert. Zara activated the holographic display, and her blood turned cold. The Kethmar Third Fleet had just jumped into the Tau Ceti system and opened fire on the civilian populations of 3 different worlds simultaneously. Preliminary estimates suggested over 50 million casualties in the first hour alone. Dear ancestors, Zara whispered, falling back in her chair. They hit Tau Ceti Prime during the Harmony Festival. There were over 30 million visitors from 40 different worlds. Marcus was already on his communicator, speaking in rapid, clipped sentences to someone on the other end. Yes, I understand. No, we can't wait for Council authorization. Activate Protocol 7 immediately. Zara looked up sharply. Protocol 7? I've never heard of that. Marcus ended his call and sat back down across from her. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than it had been all day. Zara, I need you to understand something about humans. We joined the Galactic Council because we genuinely believed in the dream of a peaceful galaxy. We wanted to learn from species that had moved beyond warfare to evolve past our own violent nature. You have evolved, Zara said desperately. Human crime rates are among the lowest in the galaxy. Your colonial expansion has been entirely peaceful. You've contributed more to interspecies cooperation than any member species in the past 50 years. We've been good neighbors, Marcus agreed. But we never stopped being human. And humans have a very simple rule about neighbors who hurt innocent people. As if summoned by his words, the cafe's news display activated, showing emergency broadcast from across the galaxy. The Tau Ceti attacks have been more devastating than initial reports suggested. The Kethmar hadn't just attacked the civilian populations. They had systematically targeted hospitals, schools, and refugee centers. Children's aid stations that Marcus himself had helped establish were burning. Zara watched her husband's face as the reports continued. She had seen Marcus angry before, frustrated by bureaucratic delays or heartbroken by refugee stories. But this was different. This was something primal and cold and absolutely terrifying. For the first time since she had known him, Marcus looked like what the Kethmar intelligence reports claimed humans could become, a predator. The Council will convene an emergency session, she said, though her voice sounded weak even to herself. We can authorize immediate humanitarian aid, perhaps even limited military intervention under Article 12 of the Emergency Response Protocol. The Council will debate for days while more children die. Marcus said. And when they finally authorize limited intervention, it will be too little, too late, exactly like it was on Kepler 442b. Zara's personal communicator chimed with an incoming call from the Velani Council representative. She accepted the call, and the holographic image of Elder Carthon appeared above the table. Ambassador Veltar, the elder said formally, the council requires your immediate presence at the emergency session. The Tau Ceti situation demands unified response. I'll be there within the hour, Elder, Zara replied. See that you are. And, Ambassador, your human husband's organization has been specifically requested to coordinate refugee assistance. The council appreciates his expertise in humanitarian matters. The call ended, and Zara looked at Marcus expectantly. But instead of acknowledging the council's recognition, Marcus was staring at his own communicator with an expression she had never seen before. Marcus? The council wants the IHAO to coordinate refugee efforts. That's what you've been pushing for. It's too late for refugees, Marcus said quietly. Look, he turned his communicator toward her, showing a live feed from the human news networks. Admiral Sarah Chun, Marcus's sister, was standing at a podium bearing the seal of the Human Defense Consortium. Behind her, Zara could see the assembled representatives of every major human military organization, citizens of the human territories and allies of humanity. Admiral Chin began. At 14:30 Galactic Standard Time, the Kethmar Empire launched unprovoked attacks against civilian populations in the Tau Ceti system. These attacks specifically targeted non-combatants, including children, medical personnel, and refugees under the protection of interstellar law. Zara felt her legs go weak. She recognized the formal language, the careful legal phrasing. This was how humans declared war. The Human Defense Consortium has concluded that the Kethmar Empire represents a clear and present danger to all sapient life in this galaxy. While we respect our allies in the Galactic Council and will continue to coordinate with them wherever possible, humanity will not stand by while innocents are slaughtered. Admiral Chun paused, and the camera pulled back to show the full scope of the assembly behind her. Representatives from Earth, Mars, the Jupiter colonies, the Alpha Centauri systems, and dozens of other human worlds. More telling were the non-human faces scattered throughout the crowd. Rigelians, vegan traders, even a few Velani colonial administrators. Effective immediately, the Human Defense Consortium is invoking Article 1 of the Terra Accords, the right of any sapient species to defend itself and its allies against genocide. The Kethmar Empire has 72 hours to withdraw all forces from occupied territories and surrender their military leadership for trial before an interstellar tribunal. Failure to comply will result in the full military response of the Human Defense Consortium and all allied forces. The broadcast ended, and the cafe fell completely silent. Zara stared at Marcus, trying to process what she had just witnessed. The Terra Accords? I've never heard of any Terra Accords. Marcus reached across the table and took her hands in his. The Terra Accord were signed by every human government before we joined the Galactic Council. They established certain non-negotiable principles that would override any external treaties if humanity ever faced an existential threat. The Council was never informed because we hoped we'd never need to invoke them. You've been planning this, Zara said, the reality finally sinking in. This whole time, while I've been trying to negotiate peace, you've been preparing for war. We've been preparing to defend innocence, Marcus corrected. There's a difference. Zara pulled her hands away and stood up. You lied to me. For 3 years, you've let me believe that humans had embraced the Council's peaceful approach. You've let me present humanity as a model for other species to follow. We haven't lied about anything, Marcus said, also standing. Humans have embraced peace. We followed every council protocol, respected every treaty, and exhausted every diplomatic option. But we never agreed to let evil triumph while we filled out paperwork. The Kethmar will see this as a declaration of war. The Kethmar committed acts of war when they started murdering civilians. Marcus's voice was harder now, and Zara could see the same cold determination she had witnessed in his sister's broadcast. The Terra Accords predate humanity's membership in the Council. The Terra Accords are a unilateral human document with no legal standing under galactic law, snapped Ambassador Kroll, his Kethmar features twisted with what might have been anger or amusement. This primitive species threatens the stability of our entire civilization. Marcus leaned forward slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a tone that Zara had never heard from him before. Ambassador Kroll, your empire has exactly 71 hours and 43 minutes to comply with our demands. I strongly suggest you use that time wisely. The Kethmar ambassador's expression shifted to something that looked distinctly like fear. You dare threaten a representative of the Kethmar Empire? I'm not threatening anyone, Marcus replied calmly. I'm simply informing you that my species has a very particular set of skills developed over millennia of conflict resolution. Skills that we had hoped never to use again. But if innocent people continue to die while you play political games, you will discover exactly why the Kethmar Intelligence Service has been studying human military history. The call ended abruptly as multiple representatives disconnected simultaneously. Zara stared at her husband, trying to reconcile the gentle humanitarian she had married with this quiet, terrifying stranger. Marcus, she said softly, what have you done? He looked at her with eyes full of sadness and determination. What humans always do when faced with evil, Zara. We've decided to stop at 60 hours after the Human Defense Consortium's ultimatum. Zara found herself in the most uncomfortable position of her diplomatic career. The Emergency Galactic Council session had been extended for the third consecutive day, with no resolution in sight. Representatives from 47 different species argued endlessly about proper procedures, legal precedents, and the dire consequences of allowing humans to act unilaterally. Meanwhile, Marcus had disappeared. Not literally. She knew exactly where he was. The Human Defense Consortium had established a command center in the Luna City military complex, and Marcus was coordinating humanitarian efforts for the inevitable refugee crisis that would follow whatever the humans were planning. But emotionally, the gentle man she had married seemed to have been replaced by someone she barely recognized. The Velani delegation formally objects to any military action that has not been properly authorized through established council protocols, Elder Carthon was saying, his image projected large above the assembly hall. The humans' unilateral decision threatens the very foundation of galactic civilization. Zara watched from the diplomatic observation deck as her own people condemned her husband's species. The irony was not lost on her that she had spent years advocating for peaceful solutions, only to discover that peace might require the threat of overwhelming violence. If I may address the council, a new voice interrupted the proceedings. The speaker was Admiral Sarah Chun, Marcus's sister, who had been granted speaking privileges as a representative of a Human Defense Consortium. She stood at the center of the circular assembly hall, surrounded by the holographic projections of species from across the galaxy. Admiral Chin, President Gexvo acknowledged, the Council recognizes your authority to speak for humanity in this matter. Thank you, President Gexvo. Admiral Chin's voice was calm and professional, but Zara could see the family resemblance in her eyes, the same quiet intensity that Marcus displayed when discussing humanitarian crises. I want to address some misconceptions that seem to have developed about humanity's intentions. Your intentions are irrelevant, Ambassador Kroll interjected. Your species has violated every principle of civilized discourse by threatening military action without proper authorization. Admiral Chun turned slightly to face the Kethmar representative directly. Ambassador Kroll, according to our intelligence reports, your empire's forces have spent the past 12 hours systematically executing prisoners of war on Tau Ceti Prime. Yesterday, your soldiers used vegan children as human shields during an assault on a medical facility. This morning, your fleet bombarded a refugee camp that was clearly marked with neutral humanitarian symbols. The assembly hall fell silent. Several representatives activated their own data terminals, accessing independent intelligence reports that confirmed Admiral Chen's statements. These are the actions of a military force, Admiral Chen continued, not an empire interested in negotiation or territorial expansion. These are the actions of a species that views genocide as a legitimate tool of statecraft. The Kethmar Empire's internal security measures are not subject to review by inferior species, Krull replied, but his translator was struggling with what sounded like nervous clicking sounds as native language. Internal security measures. Admiral Chen repeated the phrase slowly, letting it hang in the air. President Gex VO, I believe the Council needs to understand something fundamental about human psychology. My brother Marcus, whom many of you know as a humanitarian leader, has spent the past 3 years documenting Kethmar atrocities. He has personally interviewed over 10,000 refugees, compiled medical evidence of systematic torture, and mapped the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure. Zara felt her stomach tighten. She knew Marcus had been affected by his work with refugees, but she hadn't realized the scope of what he had been documenting. Marcus wanted to save lives through proper channels, Admiral Chen said. He believed in the Council's approach because he believed in peace. But yesterday, when the Kethmar targeted the children's hospital he had helped establish on Tau Ceti Prime, something in my brother broke. The Admiral paused and activated a holographic display in the center of the chamber. The image showed Marcus standing in the ruins of what had clearly been a medical facility. His clothes were torn and bloody, and he was cradling the body of what appeared to be a small alien child. This photograph was taken 6 hours ago, Admiral Chen said quietly. The child's name was Pipka. She was a vegan refugee who had lost her parents in the initial Kethmar invasion of her homeworld. Marcus had personally arranged her medical treatment for injuries sustained during her escape. When the Kethmar bombed the hospital, Pipka was undergoing surgery to repair damage from shrapnel wounds. Zara felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She remembered Marcus mentioning Pipka several times over the past few months, describing how the child had started to smile again despite everything she had endured. Marcus called me after this photograph was taken. Admiral Chen continued. Do you know what he said? He said, Sarah, I don't think I believe in peace anymore. I think I believe in justice. Ambassador Krull shifted uncomfortably. The Chun human's emotional state is irrelevant to these proceedings. The Kethmar Empire will not be threatened by primitive. Ambassador Krull, Admiral Chen interrupted, her voice still calm, but carrying an undertone that made several representatives lean back in their chairs. I need you to understand something about humans that your intelligence reports may have missed. We're not a species that threatens. We are a species that promises. She gestured, and the holographic display changed to show a tactical overview of the Tau Ceti system. Red markers indicated Kethmar fleet positions, while blue markers showed what appeared to be a much smaller human force at the edge of the system. 47 hours ago, you deployed approximately 12,000 ships to the Tau Ceti system. Your force includes 6 Dreadnought-class vessels, 18 battlecruisers, and enough support craft to maintain a blockade for several years. By any conventional measure, it should be capable of defending against a force 10 times its size. Krull's translator was making increasingly agitated clicking sounds. The Third Fleet is more than adequate to deal with any human aggression. I'm sure it is, Admiral Chen agreed. However, I should mention that 18 hours ago, a single human ship entered the Tau Ceti system. The tactical display zoomed in to show a small blip at the very edge of the system, almost invisible against the massive Kethmar fleet deployment. One ship, President Gexvo asked. Admiral Chen, surely you're not suggesting that a single human vessel could threaten such a substantial military force? Oh, not threaten, President Gexvo, Admiral Chen replied. Eliminate. The assembly hall erupted in nervous conversation. Representatives who had spent the past 3 days debating the legal implications of human military action were suddenly faced with the practical reality that such action might already be underway. The vessel is the HDC Retribution, Admiral Chen continued. It's commanded by Captain Elena Vasquez, who previously served as tactical officer aboard the Generation ship that first brought humans to this galaxy. Captain Vasquez has a very particular skill set that we developed during the AI wars. The ability to analyze enemy fleet formations and identify critical vulnerabilities. Zara activated her personal terminal and accessed the Council's military database. The HDC Retribution was listed as a light cruiser, barely 200 meters long and equipped with standard defensive armaments. According to the specifications, it was designed for reconnaissance and humanitarian support, not combat operations. Your reconnaissance ship is noted, Admiral Chun, Ambassador Cruel said with what sounded like amusement. The Third Fleet will monitor its activities in accordance with standard security protocols. Admiral Chun smiled, and for the first time since the session began, she looked genuinely happy. Ambassador Cruel, I don't think you understand. The Retribution isn't there to fight your fleet. It's there to remove it. The tactical display updated in real time, showing the movement of ships throughout the Tau Ceti system. The massive Kethmar fleet was arranged in a classic defensive formation around the 3 inhabited planets, while the tiny human ship moved slowly along the system's edge, apparently conducting routine sensor sweeps. Captain Vasquez spent 14 hours analyzing your fleet's deployment, Admiral Chen explained. She identified 47 critical vulnerabilities in your formation, including the fact that your command ship is using predictable encryption protocols and your supply vessels are operating on automated navigation systems that could be remotely accessed. Cruel's clicking became more agitated. Human technological capabilities are insufficient to challenge Kethmar fleet security. You're absolutely right, Admiral Chen agreed. Human technology is quite primitive compared to most galactic civilizations. We compensate for our technological limitations through what we call tactical innovation. The display changed again, this time showing a detailed breakdown of the Kethmar fleet's communication networks, power distribution systems, and supply chains. Red lines indicated points of failure, while yellow markers showed secondary vulnerabilities. For example, Admiral Chin said, pointing to a cluster of supply ships, "Your fleet's food distribution system relies on a centralized processing facility aboard your primary logistics vessel. Captain Vasquez has determined that a precisely targeted electromagnetic pulse could disable the facility's biocontainment systems, rendering approximately 70% of your fleet's food supplies toxic within 6 hours." Several council representatives were frantically accessing their own intelligence systems, try to verify the human claims about Kethmar fleet vulnerabilities. Similarly, Admiral Chun continued, "Your fleet's communication network routes all messages through a primary relay system that can be overwhelmed using relatively simple signal amplification techniques. A coordinated burst transmission on the correct frequencies would render your entire fleet temporarily deaf and mute." "These are theoretical vulnerabilities," Kroll protested, but his translator was struggling to keep up with his increasingly rapid speech patterns. "Your single ship cannot possibly execute such complex operations simultaneously." Admiral Chen's smile widened. "Ambassador Kroll, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The Retribution isn't going to execute these operations." She gestured again, and suddenly, the tactical display exploded with new information. What had appeared to be empty space around the Kethmar fleet was now filled with hundreds of small contacts, each barely larger than a fighter craft. "Those are human autonomous tactical drones," Admiral Chun explained matter-of-factly. "They've been in the system for approximately 36 hours, using passive stealth technology to avoid detection. Each drone is equipped with specialized equipment designed to exploit one specific vulnerability in your fleet's infrastructure." The assembly hall fell completely silent. Even the ambient noise from the environmental systems seemed to fade as every representative stared at the tactical display in shock. The massive Kethmar fleet was completely surrounded by what appeared to be a swarm of tiny human machines. "You see," Admiral Chun continued, "humans learned something important during our wars with artificial intelligence. Large, powerful weapons are impressive, but they're also vulnerable. Small, numerous, precisely targeted weapons are much more effective against complex systems. Ambassador Kroll was no longer translating his speech, simply clicking and chittering in patterns that suggested extreme agitation. Several other Kethmar representatives had joined the call, all speaking simultaneously in their native language. Admiral Chin, President Gexvio said slowly, "Are you telling this council that humanity has effectively neutralized the Kethmar Third Fleet without firing a shot?" "Not neutralized, President Gexvio," Admiral Chin replied. "Surrounded. The drones are in position to disable every critical system in the Kethmar fleet simultaneously, but they haven't actually done anything yet." "Yet," Krull managed to translate. "Yet," Admiral Chin agreed. "You still have approximately 23 hours to comply with our original demands. Withdraw your forces from all occupied territories and surrender your military leadership for trial. If you do so, the drones will withdraw peacefully, and this incident will be resolved through proper diplomatic channels." The tactical display updated again, showing text messages being transmitted from the human drones to the Kethmar fleet. The messages were simple. "You have been targeted. Comply with HDC demands, or your ship will be disabled. You will not be harmed if you surrender. This is an act of war," Krull shouted, apparently abandoning his translator entirely and speaking an accented but understandable galactic standard. "No, Ambassador Krull," Admiral Chin replied calmly. "This is an act of war prevention. Your empire can choose to withdraw peacefully, or it can choose to have its military capabilities systematically dismantled by remote control. Either way, the genocide stops today." Zara stared at the tactical display, trying to process what she was witnessing. Hundreds of tiny human machines, each one programmed with intimate knowledge of Kethmar technology, positioned to cripple one of the galaxy's most powerful military fleets without causing a single casualty. It was exactly the kind of precise, overwhelming response that Marcus had described as uniquely human. President Gexvio was consulting with his advisory staff, speaking in rapid whispers while the rest of the council waited in stunned silence. Finally, he turned back to address Admiral Chun. "Admiral, the Council appreciates humanity's innovative approach to conflict resolution. However, we must insist that any military action be coordinated through proper diplomatic channels. Surely some compromise can be reached." Admiral Chin nodded respectfully. "President Gexvio, humanity deeply values its membership in the Galactic Council and will continue to work within established diplomatic frameworks wherever possible. However, I should mention that the drones surrounding the Kethmar fleet represent only a small fraction of human tactical capabilities." She gestured one final time, and the display pulled back to show the entire galaxy. Suddenly, red markers began appearing throughout known space, each one representing a human military asset that had apparently been positioned without anyone's knowledge. The Human Defense Consortium has been preparing for this possibility for several years, Admiral Chin said quietly. "We hoped it would never be necessary, but we have the capability to simultaneously neutralize every Kethmar military installation in the galaxy within 72 hours. The number of red markers was staggering. There were human assets positioned near every major Kethmar base, every occupied world, every strategic resource in Kethmar space. More disturbing were the markers positioned near the home worlds of other galactic civilizations, including several near Velani territory. The message to the galaxy is simple," Admiral Chin concluded. "Humanity will not tolerate genocide. We will not stand by while innocent beings are tortured and murdered for the political ambitions of any empire, regardless of their military strength or political connections." Ambassador Krull had gone completely silent, staring at the display with what Zara recognized as pure terror. The other council representatives were frantically accessing their own military intelligence, trying to determine if their own territories had been similarly infiltrated. "The Kethmar Empire has 22 hours to comply with our demands," Admiral Chin said. "If they choose not to comply, They will discover that humanity's reputation for violence is not a relic of our primitive past. It is a carefully maintained capability that we employ only when all other options have been exhausted. The session was suspended as emergency consultations began among the various species leadership. Zara made her way to the Luna City military complex, her mind reeling from what she had witnessed. The human she had married was part of a species that had apparently spent years preparing to single-handedly police the entire galaxy. She found Marcus in a small office overlooking the command center, staring out at the Earth hanging in the black sky. He looked exhausted, older than he had just days before. "Did you watch the council session?" he asked without turning around. "I watched my sister threaten to dismantle galactic civilization," Zara replied, sitting down in the chair next to his desk. Marcus finally turned to look at her, and she saw that his eyes were red with unshed tears. Pipka was 7 years old, Zara. 7. She had learned to speak 3 different languages because she wanted to help other refugee children who didn't speak Galactic Standard. "I know," Zara said softly. "I'm sorry about Pipka. I'm sorry about all of them. Are you sorry about what we're doing to stop it?" Zara considered the question carefully. As a diplomat, she was horrified by the breakdown of established protocols and the threat to galactic stability. As a being who valued life and justice, she was awed by the precision and restraint the humans had shown in their response. "I'm terrified about what you're doing," she said finally. "But I think I understand why you're doing it." Marcus reached over and took her hand. "The Kethmar will probably surrender," he said quietly. "Our intelligence suggests that their leadership is primarily motivated by opportunism rather than ideology. When they realize that continuing their expansion will result in the complete destruction of their military capabilities, they'll likely calculate that withdrawal is the more profitable option. And if they don't surrender?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Then, the galaxy will learn why humans developed a reputation for being dangerous long before we develop a reputation for being peaceful." The Kethmar Empire's response came with 3 hours remaining on the human ultimatum. Primitive mammals. Grand Admiral Thekvor's transmission began, his massive form filling the main display in the Human Defense Consortium Command Center. The Kethmar leader's 6 arms gestured dismissively, while his translator rendered his words into multiple galactic languages simultaneously. "Your pathetic technological trinkets do not frighten the heirs of the eternal conquest." Zara watched from the observation deck as hundreds of human military personnel continued their work with calm efficiency. There was no panic, no frantic last-minute preparations. If anything, the humans seemed almost relieved that diplomacy had finally failed. "The Third Fleet will demonstrate the folly of challenging Kethmar superiority," Thekvor continued. "Your drones will be destroyed, your ships will be scattered, and your species will learn the price of interfering with the destiny of superior beings." The transmission ended, and Admiral Sarah Chun turned to address the assembled staff. "All stations, confirm readiness status. Tactical coordination online," reported a voice from the drone control station. "Fleet assets in position and awaiting orders," came from the strategic command desk. "Refugee evacuation protocols activated on all occupied worlds," announced the humanitarian coordination section. Admiral Chin nodded and activated the main tactical display. The view showed the Tau Ceti system, where the massive Kethmar fleet was beginning to break formation. Instead of withdrawing as the humans had demanded, the Kethmar ships were moving to attack positions around the tiny HDC Retribution. "Captain Vasquez," Admiral Chin spoke into her communicator, "you are authorized to implement Protocol 7. Show them what humans do when we're finished talking." Marcus, who had been standing quietly beside Zara, suddenly gripped the observation deck railing. "Sarah, wait. There are still civilian populations on those worlds. If the Kethmar retaliate..." Marcus, his sister, interrupted gently. "Trust us. We've had 3 years to plan this." The tactical display zoomed in to show individual ships within the Kethmar fleet. Each vessel was now marked with dozens of small red dots, representing the human drones that had silently positioned themselves throughout the enemy formation. For several seconds, nothing seemed to happen. Then, the lights went out. Not literally. The command center's emergency lighting immediately activated, but on the tactical display, the massive Kethmar dreadnoughts simply went dark. One by one, the power signatures of 12,000 enemy ships flatlined as their primary systems were simultaneously disabled. "What did you do?" Zara whispered. "Electromagnetic pulse bursts targeted at their primary power coupling systems," Admiral Chun explained matter-of-factly. The drones delivered precisely calibrated energy discharges that overloaded their main reactors without causing dangerous explosions. Every ship in their fleet just lost power, life support, communications, and navigation. On the display, the Kethmar vessels were beginning to drift. Without power for their engines or maneuvering thrusters, 12,000 ships were now floating helplessly in space while their crews struggled to restore emergency systems. "This is impossible," came Grand Admiral Thekvor's voice over the emergency communication channel. The transmission was weak and filled with static, clearly coming from backup systems. "Our shields were raised. Our point defenses were active." Admiral Thekvor, Captain Vasquez's voice responded from the HDC Retribution. "Your shield were calibrated to deflect weapons fire, not microscopic infiltration drones. Your point defenses were designed to track incoming missiles, not autonomous units smaller than your sensor resolution." Humanity spent several centuries learning to fight enemies with superior technology. We got very good at finding creative solutions. Zara stared at the tactical display in amazement. The most powerful military fleet in known galactic history had been neutralized in less than 30 seconds by machines so small that the enemy sensors couldn't even detect them. "Your crews are unharmed," Captain Vasquez continued, "but your ships will remain powerless until you comply with our demands. We've also disabled your communication systems to prevent coordination of any counterattack. However, this channel will remain open so that you can announce your surrender when you're ready." The channel went silent. On the tactical display, hundreds of small human vessels began moving into the system. Medical ships, refugee transports, and engineering craft designed to provide humanitarian assistance to both the liberated populations and the disabled Kethmar crews. "How long can they survive without power?" Marcus asked. "Each ship has approximately 48 hours of emergency life support," Admiral Chen replied. "More than enough time for them to realize that cooperation is their only viable option. Meanwhile, our medical teams are already en route to the surface to begin treating casualties from the occupation." Zara watched as the rescue operations began. The humans weren't just disabling enemy ships. They were simultaneously implementing a comprehensive humanitarian response. Medical facilities that had been destroyed during the Kethmar attacks were being replaced with mobile human hospitals. Refugee camps were being established with supplies and personnel already in transit. "This is incredible," she said softly. "You planned for both the military operation and the civilian relief efforts simultaneously." "That's how humans fight wars, Zura," Marcus replied. "We don't just defeat enemies. We rebuild what they destroyed and make sure it doesn't happen again." Admiral Chan was coordinating with multiple departments simultaneously, her voice calm and professional as she managed what was essentially a galactic-scale emergency response operation. Medical teams to Tau Ceti Prime, refugee coordination to Tau Ceti 7, engineering corps to restore infrastructure on all three worlds. "I want civilian populations receiving aid within 6 hours." "Admiral," came a voice from the communication station, "we're receiving priority transmissions from Kethmar military installations throughout their territory. They're demanding to know the status of the Third Fleet." "Put them through," Admiral Chen ordered. The main display filled with the faces of Kethmar military commanders from across their empire. Their expressions ranged from confusion to anger to poorly concealed fear. "What have you done to our fleet?" demanded one of the commanders, his translator struggling with rapid-fire questions in the Kethmar language. "We have demonstrated human capabilities," Admiral Chan replied calmly. "Your Third Fleet is intact but powerless. Your crews are unharmed but unable to continue their attacks against civilian populations. They will remain in this condition until your empire complies with our demands. The Kethmar Empire does not negotiate with inferior species, another commander shouted. You're not negotiating, Admiral Chen pointed out. You're being informed of new reality. Your most powerful fleet has been neutralized without a single human casualty. More importantly, it was neutralized by a force so small that your sensors couldn't detect it until it was too late. She gestured, and the tactical display switched to show the entire galaxy. The red markers representing human assets began to pulse slowly, drawing attention to their positions near every major Kethmar installation. These assets have been in position for months, Admiral Chen continued. While your empire was planning its expansion, humanity was planning your containment. Every military base, every occupied world, every strategic resource in Kethmar space is currently within range of human tactical capabilities. The Kethmar commanders fell silent, apparently accessing their own intelligence reports to verify the human claims. However, Admiral Chen added, her tone becoming slightly more diplomatic, humanity prefers peaceful solutions. If the Kethmar Empire announces its immediate withdrawal from all occupied territories and agrees to submit its military leadership for trial before an interstellar tribunal, we can resolve this situation without further conflict. And if we refuse, one of the commanders asked. Admiral Chen's expression didn't change, but somehow her presence seemed to fill the entire command center. Then, you will discover that the Third Fleet's current situation is just a demonstration. Humanity has the capability to disable every Kethmar military asset simultaneously. Your choice is whether you want to negotiate withdrawal while you still have ships to withdraw, or whether you want to negotiate from a position of having no military capabilities whatsoever. Before any of the commanders could respond, new alarms began sounding throughout the command center. A communications officer turned toward Admiral Chen with a look of concern. Admiral, we're receiving an emergency transmission from the Galactic Council. President Gexvio is demanding immediate human compliance with emergency peace protocols. Admiral Chen sighed. Put the president through. President Gexvio's ancient Thurlian features appeared on a secondary display, his expression showing the strain of the past few days. Admiral Chen, the Council has voted to invoke Article 15 of the Galactic Peace Accords. All military operations must cease immediately to allow for mediated negotiations. President Gexvio, Admiral Chen replied respectfully, humanity appreciates the Council's concern for galactic stability. However, I should point out that Article 15 requires the consent of all parties to a conflict. The Kethmar Empire has not requested mediation. The Kethmar Empire is hereby requesting council mediation, Grand Admiral Thekvor's voice interjected from the disabled fleet. We invoke our right to protection under galactic law. Zara leaned forward, recognizing the legal maneuver. By requesting council intervention, the Kethmar were essentially admitting they couldn't handle the human response militarily, while simultaneously trying to use galactic bureaucracy to avoid the consequences of their actions. Very well, Admiral Chen said. Humanity will honor council mediation protocols. However, I should mention that our current military operations fall under the category of humanitarian intervention rather than acts of war. We are not attacking Kethmar forces. We are simply preventing them from attacking civilians. Your drones have disabled our entire fleet. Tigful protested. Your entire fleet was engaged in genocide, Admiral Chen replied calmly. Under interstellar law, any actions necessary to prevent ongoing crimes against humanity are considered defensive measures, not aggressive acts. President Gexvio was consulting with his legal advisors, apparently trying to determine whether the human position had any basis in galactic law. Admiral Chen, he said finally, the Council requests that you maintain current positions while mediation proceedings begin. However, we must also request that you refrain from expanding operations against other Kethmar territories. I'm afraid that's not possible, President Gexvio, Admiral Chen replied. Our intelligence indicates that Kethmar forces on 17 different worlds are currently executing prisoners in response to the Third Fleet situation. Humanitarian law requires us to prevent these atrocities. As if to emphasize her point, the galactic tactical display began updating in real time. Throughout Kethmar space, small human assets were beginning to move toward their targets. The precision was astounding. Each asset was positioned to neutralize specific military targets while avoiding any civilian areas. "How many assets do you have deployed?" President Gexvio asked quietly. Admiral Chen consulted her tactical display. Approximately 47,000 autonomous units, positioned at 1,312 strategic locations across Kethmar territory. Each unit is programmed with detailed intelligence about its target and specific instructions to minimize collateral damage. The number was staggering. The human military had infiltrated the entire Kethmar Empire without anyone noticing, positioning enough assets to simultaneously neutralize the galaxy's most aggressive civilization. "Admiral," Marcus spoke from the observation deck. "What happens after we disable their military? Are we planning to occupy Kethmar territory?" "Absolutely not," Admiral Chen replied immediately. "Humanity has no interest in conquest or occupation. Once Kethmar military capabilities have been neutralized and their leadership has been handed over for trial, we will withdraw completely. The occupied worlds will be returned to their original inhabitants, and the Kethmar civilian population will be free to establish whatever government they choose, as long as it doesn't include genocide as a policy option." Zara found herself amazed by the scope and precision of human planning. They had prepared not just for military victory, but for the entire post-conflict reconstruction process. Medical teams, engineering corps, refugee assistance, even temporary governmental structures for liberated worlds. Everything had been anticipated and prepared. "The Council requires time to consider this unprecedented situation," President Gexvio announced. "All parties will maintain current positions while legal precedents are researched and proper procedures are established." "Of course, President Gexvio," Admiral Chen agreed. "However, I should mention that maintaining current positions means that Kethmar forces throughout their empire will remain disabled until negotiations are complete. Our humanitarian teams will continue providing assistance to both Kethmar crews and liberated civilian populations during this period." The transmission ended, and the command center returned to its quiet efficiency. Zara watched as hundreds of human personnel continued coordinating the largest humanitarian operation in galactic history, all while maintaining a military readiness that had just demonstrated the capability to neutralize an entire star empire in minutes. "Marcus," she said softly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. How long has humanity been capable of this? Not just the military technology, but the coordination, the intelligence gathering, the humanitarian infrastructure? This isn't something you could have developed in response to the Kethmar crisis." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "We've been preparing since the day we joined the Galactic Council," he said finally. "Not because we wanted to conquer anyone, but because we wanted to make sure that what happened to Earth during the AI wars never happened to anyone else." "The AI wars ended over 200 years ago." "Yes," Marcus replied. 200 years of remembering what it's like to watch helplessly while innocents die. 200 years of promising ourselves that if we ever had the power to prevent it, we would never allow genocide to succeed." Zara looked out at the tactical displays showing human forces positioned throughout the galaxy, not as conquerors but as guardians. For the first time since the crisis began, she understood what her husband had meant when he said that humans had evolved beyond their violent nature without abandoning their capacity for violence. "You're not trying to rule the galaxy," she said, the realization dawning on her. "You're trying to protect it." Marcus nodded. "Peace was always the plan, Zara. But sometimes peace requires the credible threat of overwhelming force." The Galactic Council's emergency mediation session had been in progress for 6 hours when everything changed. Zara sat in the diplomatic gallery, watching as representatives from 47 different species attempted to establish legal frameworks for a situation that had no precedent in galactic history. The humans had effectively neutralized the military capabilities of an entire star empire without firing a shot, while simultaneously launching the largest humanitarian operation ever recorded. No existing law covered such circumstances. The Rigellian Consortium recognizes humanity's claimed humanitarian motivations, Ambassador Kelthera was saying, her crystalline features reflecting the chamber's ambient light. However, the unilateral deployment of military assets without council authorization represents a fundamental threat to galactic governance. Marcus had been called away from the session to coordinate refugee operations, leaving Zara to observe the proceedings alone. She found herself in the strange position of defending her husband's species while simultaneously trying to understand the implications of their actions. If I may address the distinguished Rigellian representative, Admiral Chen responded from the center of the chamber. Humanity's actions were taken under the authority of the Terra Accords, which predate our membership in this council. More importantly, they were taken to prevent ongoing genocide, which supersedes any procedural considerations under interstellar law. President Gex-VO consulted his legal advisors before responding. Admiral Chun, while the Council acknowledges humanity's humanitarian concerns, the deployment of military assets throughout galactic space without proper notification creates dangerous precedents. What prevents other species from taking similar unilateral actions based on their interpretation of interstellar law? President Gex-VO, Admiral Chun replied calmly. What prevents other species from committing genocide based on their interpretation of territorial sovereignty? The Council has spent 6 days debating proper procedures while civilians died. Humanity simply decided that some things are more important than bureaucracy. The chamber fell silent. Several representatives shifted uncomfortably as the human admiral's words highlighted the Council's institutional failures during the crisis. The human position is noted, President Gex-VO said diplomatically. However, the Council must consider the broader implications of allowing any member species to deploy military force without authorization, regardless of their stated motivations. Before Admiral Chun could respond, emergency alarms began sounding throughout the chamber. A communications officer rushed to President Gex-VO's side and whispered urgently in his ear. The president's ancient features paled as he absorbed whatever information he had received. Ladies and gentlemen, President Gex-VO announced, his voice carrying a note of barely controlled panic. We have just received an emergency transmission from the Kethmar Empire's capital world. Grand Imperator Zathkal wishes to address this assembly directly. The main holographic display activated, showing the throne room of the Kethmar Empire. Grand Imperator Zathkal, the absolute ruler of the most aggressive militaristic society in known space, sat on his massive ceremonial throne surrounded by the symbols of conquered worlds. But something was wrong with the image. The transmission was coming from emergency backup systems, and several of Zathkal's advisors appeared to be in states of barely controlled terror. Council of Inferior Species, Zathkal began, his translator rendering his words with the usual Kethmar arrogance. The Eternal Empire demands immediate cessation of human aggression against our sovereign territory. Admiral Chen stood and addressed the projection directly. Grand Imperator Zathkal, humanity has made no aggressive moves against your territory. We have simply disabled military assets that were being used to commit genocide. You have invaded our space with your technological parasites. Zathkal roared, his 6 arms gesturing wildly. You have crippled our fleets, infiltrated our installations, and the transmission cut off abruptly. When it resumed several seconds later, the Grand Imperator appeared to be receiving urgent reports from his military advisors. His expression shifted from anger to confusion to something that looked remarkably like fear. Impossible, he muttered, apparently forgetting that the transmission was still active. How can they be everywhere at once? Admiral Chun activated her own tactical display, showing the current status of operations throughout Kethmar space. Grand Imperator, Perhaps you would like to explain to the Council what your forces have been attempting to do for the past 6 hours. The Galactic Tactical Overview showed a stunning level of activity. Throughout Kethmar territory, military installations were going offline in rapid succession. Not destroyed, simply disabled, with their power systems knocked out and their communication arrays rendered inoperable. Simultaneously, humanitarian assets were moving to provide assistance to liberated civilian populations. The humans are systematically dismantling our entire military infrastructure, one of Zathkol's advisors reported, apparently not realizing that the council session was still receiving their transmission. Every base, every outpost, every strategic installation is being neutralized simultaneously. How many human ships? Satkul demanded. That's just it, Grand Imperator. Our sensors show no human ships, no human fleets, nothing large enough to pose a military threat. But our facilities are losing power and communications across 17 star systems. Admiral Chen cleared her throat, drawing attention back to the council chamber. Grand Imperator, your military is being neutralized by the same autonomous systems that disabled your third fleet. Microscopic infiltration drones that have been positioned throughout your territory for the past several months. The implications of her statement sent shocked murmurs throughout the council assembly. The humans hadn't just prepared to neutralize a single fleet. They had prepared to neutralize an entire galactic empire. This is an act of war, Zathkal shouted, apparently regaining his composure. The Eternal Empire will respond with the full might of our remaining forces. What remaining forces? Admiral Chun asked quietly. On the tactical display, the devastating scope of human operations became clear. Every major Kethmar military installation across their entire territory was now marked with red status indicators. 17 star systems, over 1,000 major facilities, hundreds of thousands of military personnel, all effectively neutralized within 6 hours. Your army bases have lost power and communications, Admiral Chin continued. Your naval installations cannot launch ships or coordinate operations. Your orbital defense platforms are offline. Your strategic command centers are operating on emergency backup systems only. Grand Imperator, the Kethmar Empire's military no longer exists as a functional organization. The silence in the council chamber was absolute. Representatives from dozens of different species stared at the tactical display in amazement and terror. The humans had just demonstrated the capability to single-handedly neutralize the galaxy's most powerful military empire in less than a day. However, Admiral Chen added, her tone becoming more diplomatic, your civilian infrastructure is completely intact. Your cities are unharmed, your population centers have not been attacked, and your governmental functions continue to operate normally. Humanity has no quarrel with the Kethmar people, only with your empire's military leadership. Zathkal was consulting frantically with his advisors, apparently trying to understand the scope of what had happened to his forces. Grand Imperator, President Gexvio interjected, the Council strongly encourages you to consider the human offer of negotiated settlement. The current situation provides an opportunity for peaceful resolution without further escalation. Peaceful resolution? Satkul loged bitterly. The humans have destroyed everything we spent centuries building. Our fleets, our bases, our entire military structure lies in ruins. Actually, Admiral Chun corrected, your military infrastructure is completely intact. We've simply disabled it temporarily. Power can be restored, communications can be re-established, and your personnel are unharmed. If you comply with our demands, your empire can retain its territorial integrity and civilian government. And if we refuse, Admiral Chin's expression didn't change, but somehow her presence seemed to expand, filling the chamber with quiet authority. Then, the disabling becomes permanent. Your military installations will remain powerless indefinitely. Your occupied territories will be permanently liberated, and your empire will exist as a civilian-only organization under permanent humanitarian oversight. You cannot monitor an entire star empire. Grand Imperator, Admiral Chen replied calmly. We just neutralize an entire star empire in 6 hours using assets you couldn't detect until they activated. Monitoring your compliance will be significantly easier than dismantling your military capabilities. Zara watched the exchange with growing understanding. The humans weren't conquering the Kethmar Empire. They were offering them a choice between civilized behavior and complete military irrelevance. It was perhaps the most sophisticated application of overwhelming force in galactic history. The Council requests a brief recess to allow the Grand Imperator to consult with his advisors, President HFY announced diplomatically. The transmission from the Kethmar capital ended, leaving the Council chamber buzzing with nervous conversation. Admiral Chun remained at the center of the assembly, calmly fielding questions from various representatives while monitoring ongoing operations through her personal communicator. Admiral Chun, Ambassador Kelthra asked, the Rigelian Consortium must know, do human forces have similar capabilities deployed near other member worlds? The Human Defense Consortium has assets positioned throughout the galaxy, Admiral Chen replied honestly. However, these assets are programmed to respond only to specific threat profiles. Species that do not engage in genocide, territorial conquest, or systematic oppression have nothing to fear from human military capabilities. And who determines these threat profiles? Demanded the representative from the Vegan Trade Federation. Independent analysis conducted by multiple human intelligence agencies, verified through cooperation with local resistance movements and refugee testimony, Admiral Chen explained. The same intelligence-gathering network that documented Kethmar atrocities and identified their military vulnerabilities. Zara found herself impressed by the transparency of the human response. Rather than hiding their capabilities or making vague threats, they were openly explaining their methods and criteria. It was a sophisticated approach to establishing deterrence while maintaining diplomatic relationships. Admiral, President HFY said, the Council must ask directly, does humanity intend to establish itself as the galaxy's military authority? Admiral Chun was quiet for a moment before responding. President HFY, humanity has no desire to rule anyone or anything beyond our own territories. We simply want to ensure that what happened on Earth during the AI wars never happens to anyone else. If the Council can establish effective mechanisms for preventing genocide and systematic oppression, humanity will gladly return to purely humanitarian activities. And if the Council cannot establish such mechanisms, then humanity will continue to provide them unilaterally until the Council can. The implications of her statement were clear. The humans were essentially offering to serve as the galaxy's military conscience, intervening only when other species engaged in behavior that threatened the fundamental rights of sapient beings. Before President HFY could respond, Marcus entered the chamber and approached Admiral Chen. He whispered urgently in her ear, and Zara saw her expression shift to one of concern. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Chen announced, I've just received an urgent report from our humanitarian teams on the liberated worlds. The scope of Kethmar atrocities was significantly worse than our initial intelligence indicated. She activated a new holographic display showing medical reports, survivor testimonies, and documentary evidence from the recently liberated territories. The images were horrific: systematic torture, medical experimentation, deliberate starvation, and mass executions conducted as psychological warfare against surviving populations. These facilities were discovered on every world occupied by Kethmar forces, Admiral Chun said quietly. Our medical teams estimate that over 40 million sapient beings were killed in what can only be described as concentration camps designed for maximum psychological trauma. The Council chamber fell silent as representatives absorbed the scope of what the Kethmar Empire had been doing to conquered populations. Several ambassadors were visibly shaken by the evidence. The Kethmar military leadership responsible for these atrocities must face justice, Admiral Chin continued. Humanity will not negotiate on this point. They will be handed over for trial before an interstellar tribunal, where they will be extracted by human forces. President Gexvo looked around the chamber, apparently gauging the reaction of the various representatives. The Council will take these new revelations under advisement during our deliberations with the Grand Imperator. President Gexvo, Admiral Chun said firmly, there is nothing to deliberate. The evidence is clear, the law is unambiguous, and humanity's position is non-negotiable. The only question is whether the Kethmar Empire will cooperate with justice willingly or whether it will be compelled to do so. The emergency alarms sounded again, and the Kethmar transmission reactivated. This time, Grand Imperator Zathkal appeared alone, his massive form hunched forward on his throne. When he spoke, his voice carried none of its previous arrogance. Human Admiral, he said quietly, the Eternal Empire wishes to discuss terms 2 months after the Kethmar capitulation, as galactic historians would later call it. Zara stood in the same lunar cafe where this crisis had begun. The view outside the window was different now. Earth hung in the black sky, as it always had, but the space around it was filled with a steady stream of refugee ships arriving for medical treatment and resettlement assistance. Marcus sat across from her, reviewing reports from humanitarian operations on the liberated worlds. The dark circles under his eyes had finally begun to fade, though she suspected he would carry the emotional weight of what he had witnessed for the rest of his life. The reconstruction efforts on Kepler 442b are ahead of schedule, he said, looking up from his tablet. The engineering corps finished restoring the hospital infrastructure last week, and the psychological trauma counseling programs are beginning to show positive results. What about the Kethmar prisoners? Zara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Grand Imperator Zathkal and 47 high-ranking military commanders are awaiting trial at the Interstellar Tribunal on Proxima Centauri b, Marcus replied. The evidence is overwhelming. Even their own military records document the systematic nature of their crimes. Zara nodded, sipping her coffee while she processed the magnitude of what had transpired. The Kethmar Empire still existed, but it was now a shadow of its former self. Their military had been permanently disbanded under the terms of the surrender agreement. Their occupied territories had been liberated and returned to their original inhabitants, and their government was operating under strict humanitarian oversight provided by a coalition of council species, led by human observers. The council finally approved the new emergency intervention protocols yesterday, she said, changing the subject to something slightly less depressing. Really? Marcus looked genuinely surprised. I thought it would take them years to agree on anything that's specific. Well, your sister's demonstration had a certain motivational effect on the legislative process, Zara replied dryly. When 47 different species suddenly realize that one member civilization has the capability to neutralize all of their military assets simultaneously, they become very interested in establishing clear rules for when such capabilities can be used. The new protocols were actually quite sophisticated, establishing precise criteria for humanitarian intervention and creating rapid response mechanisms that could authorize military action within hours rather than months. More importantly, they included provisions for multiple species to contribute to intervention forces, ensuring that no single civilization would have to bear the burden of galactic peacekeeping alone. Is humanity planning to comply with the new protocols? Zara asked. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since the crisis began. We helped write them, Zara. Admiral Chin spent 3 weeks working with council legal advisors to make sure the new system would actually work when needed. And the military assets that were deployed throughout the galaxy? Most of them have been withdrawn, Marcus said. We kept monitoring stations in a few locations where there are ongoing humanitarian concerns, but the autonomous tactical units have been recalled. The deterrent effect seems to be working. 3 different territorial disputes were resolved through negotiation last month after the parties involved realized that aggression might trigger human intervention. Zara found that particularly interesting. The mere knowledge that humans possessed overwhelming military capabilities had apparently motivated several species to resolve their conflicts peacefully rather than risk escalation. It was exactly the kind of peace-through-strength approach that human military doctrine had always favored. What about the Kethmar civilian population? How are they adapting to the changes? Marcus pulled up another report showing demographic and economic data from former Kethmar territory. Actually, remarkably well. It turns out that the Kethmar military leadership had been systematically oppressing their own people almost as brutally as they oppressed conquered populations. With the military hierarchy eliminated, Kethmar civilian society is beginning to develop more democratic institutions. And the liberated worlds? That's where the real success story is, Marcus said, his expression brightening. 17 different species that have been subjugated by the Kethmar are now working together to establish a mutual defense confederation. They're calling it the Liberation Alliance, and they've specifically requested human technical assistance in developing non-lethal defense systems. Zara smiled at the irony. The humans had developed weapons capable of neutralizing entire star empires, and now other species wanted to learn how to build similar capabilities for defensive purposes. It was exactly the kind of technology transfer that could prevent future genocides without escalating galactic militarization. The Council has formally asked humanity to establish a peacekeeping training academy, she said. They want other species to learn human tactical and humanitarian coordination techniques. Sarah mentioned that. Marcus replied, she's actually considering accepting the position as the Academy's first director. The idea is to teach other species how to identify and respond to humanitarian crises before they escalate to the level that requires military intervention. It was a logical evolution of human strategy. Rather than maintaining the capability to intervene in every potential crisis, they were teaching other species to intervene more effectively themselves. The galaxy was essentially learning to police itself using human-developed methods. There's something I want to ask you, Zara said, setting down her coffee and looking directly at Marcus. The night before everything started, when you told me that evil doesn't negotiate, did you already know about the autonomous drones? Marcus was quiet for a moment. I knew that humanity had capabilities that hadn't been publicly disclosed, he said finally. But I didn't know the scope or the specific technical details. Sarah and the military leadership kept operational security very tight. But you knew that the humanitarian approach wasn't the only option available. I knew that humans would never allow genocide to continue indefinitely while bureaucrats debated proper procedures, Marcus replied. I just hoped it wouldn't come to that. Zara reached across the table and took his hand. Do you regret what happened? Marcus looked out the window at the refugee ships arriving in Earth orbit. Each one carrying survivors would have died if the Council's diplomatic approach had continued unchanged. I regret that it was necessary, he said quietly. But I don't regret that we did it. The Galactic Council is a better institution now because of what you did, Zara said. The new emergency intervention protocols will save lives, the Peacekeeping Training Academy will prevent crises, and 47 different species now know that genocide has consequences. What about us? Marcus asked, how do you feel about being married to someone whose species just demonstrated that they could conquer the galaxy if they chose to? Zara considered the question carefully. I feel proud, she said finally. Proud that humans had the capability to conquer the galaxy and chose not to. Proud that they used overwhelming force only to protect innocence. And proud that they immediately began sharing their capabilities with others instead of hoarding them for strategic advantage. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. The Peacekeeping Academy is going to be built here on Luna, he said. Sarah wants me to develop the humanitarian coordination curriculum. We could design the programs together, combine human tactical thinking with Velani diplomatic techniques. A joint human-Velani approach to peacekeeping? Why not? Your species understands negotiation and conflict resolution better than anyone in the galaxy. My species understands rapid tactical response and humanitarian logistics. Together, we might be able to prevent the next Kethmar Empire before it gets started. Zara smiled, imagining the possibilities. A training academy where young diplomats and military officers from dozens of different species would learn to work together, combining the best aspects of their various cultures and capabilities. It was exactly the kind of institutional development that could ensure galactic peace for generations. There's one more thing, Marcus said, pulling out a small device that Zara recognized as a personal communicator configured for priority transmissions. Admiral, Chen asked me to extend an invitation to you. What kind of invitation? The Council has approved the formation of a new department, the Office of Interspecies Humanitarian Coordination. They want someone with your diplomatic experience to serve as the first director, working directly with the Peacekeeping Training Academy to develop rapid response protocols. Zara stared at the communicator, understanding the implications. The position would essentially make her the galaxy's chief humanitarian diplomat, responsible for coordinating international responses to crises before they escalated to the point of requiring military intervention. It would mean working very closely with human military planners, Marcus added with a slight smile. Particularly one human who's going to be designing humanitarian logistics curricula. Are you asking me to take the job because it's the right thing to do, or because you want to work with your wife? Both, Marcus replied honestly. The galaxy needs someone who understands both diplomatic protocol and humanitarian urgency. And I need someone who can keep me focused on saving lives instead of just winning conflicts. Zara looked around the cafe, remembering the conversation they had shared just 2 months earlier. Then, she had been defending a diplomatic system that had been fundamentally incapable of responding to true evil. Now, she was being offered the chance to help design a new system that could prevent such evil from ever taking root. Will humanity really accept civilian oversight of their military capabilities? She asked. Zara, humanity never wanted to be the galaxy's police force, Marcus replied. We just wanted to make sure that innocents were protected. If the Council can establish institutions that accomplish that goal, we'll gladly go back to building hospitals and schools. She activated the communicator and addressed Admiral Chun directly. Admiral, Ambassador Zara,